Have you ever reached a moment where your faith felt so fragile that even praying seemed impossible? That quiet space where your spirit trembles, where fear speaks louder than hope, where you wonder if God still sees you or if your strength has finally run out. Psalm 27 begins exactly in that kind of place, not with confidence born from victory, but with a cry rising from a soul that has walked through darkness long enough to crave light again. What makes this psalm so powerful is not just its poetry, but the spiritual truth beneath its words. Faith is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to believe while fear breathes down your neck. When David declares, "The Lord is my light and my salvation," he is not speaking as a man untouched by storms. He speaks as someone who has tasted danger, betrayal, loneliness, and spiritual exhaustion. Yet he makes a choice, a deliberate internal shift. He names God as his light while still standing in the shadows. He calls God his salvation while threats still surround him. This is where weak faith begins to renew itself, not by pretending everything is fine, but by anchoring the heart in a truth stronger than any circumstance. And maybe that is where you are right now, holding on by a thread, whispering prayers you hope heaven still hears. Psalm 27 confronts the very fears that chase you. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of being abandoned, fear of not being enough. It exposes the lies that grow inside tired hearts and replaces them with a reminder that God is near, even when your faith is faint. What if the weakness you feel today is not a sign of spiritual decline, but an invitation for God to rebuild your strength in a deeper way than before? What if this moment of fragility is the doorway to a renewed confidence that does not depend on your own power, but on His unwavering presence? You already know how heavy life can become. But this psalm whispers something you may have forgotten. You are not standing alone. You have probably walked through seasons where you questioned everything, including yourself. Maybe you are in one of them now. But there is something waiting for you in these ancient words, something that stirs faith back to life when it has been drained. And as you allow this message to sink deeper, pause and ask yourself, have you ever felt God trying to reach you through your weakest moments, guiding you back to strength, even when you could not see the way? If this speaks to you, take a moment to share your experience in the comments. Leave a like to help this message reach more people who feel the same weight, and check if you are already subscribed, because what comes next may be exactly what your heart has been needing as we continue this journey into the heart of Psalm 27. When faith feels fragile, the heaviest battles are rarely the ones people can see. They unfold quietly inside the heart, in places no one else has access to. You can stand among friends, go to work, smile at the world, and still feel a storm trembling beneath your ribs. That is the paradox of spiritual struggle. Your life can look perfectly functional on the outside, while your soul is fighting for breath on the inside. And this is where Psalm 27 begins to feel less like ancient scripture and more like a mirror, reflecting the exact conflicts you have carried alone. There are fears you never spoke aloud, memories that return at night, doubts that follow you even when you try to pray. You may feel unsteady, pulled between wanting to trust God and feeling overwhelmed by what you cannot control. But here is something profound. Inner battles do not mean your faith is weak. They often mean your heart is longing for God in ways deeper than words can express. The tension you feel between courage and fear, hope and uncertainty, desire for God and exhaustion from the journey is the very space where transformation begins. David understood that tension. His battles were not only against armies and enemies, but against the voices inside him that whispered danger, abandonment, and defeat. When he wrote, "Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear," he was not describing a confident man whose emotions always obeyed his intentions. He was describing a man who refused to let internal battles decide the direction of his soul. He acknowledged the weight pressing against his spirit, yet he still chose trust. That choice did not erase the struggle, but it shifted the atmosphere. Inside his heart, maybe you have been carrying a quiet heaviness too, the kind of pressure that makes even small tasks feel overwhelming, the kind that steals your sleep, drains your joy, or makes you question whether you are still spiritually strong. But Psalm 27 speaks directly into that kind of invisible fatigue by reminding you that God sees what others cannot. He does not measure your faith by how loudly you worship or how steady you look. He sees the effort beneath the surface, the moments you keep walking even when your strength is low, the silent prayers you whisper because you do not know what else to say. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is not shouting declarations of victory, but simply refusing to give up when your heart feels uncertain. And that is what this psalm begins to rebuild within you, the understanding that God is not asking for perfection, only for honesty, for a heart that shows up even when shaken. The inner battles you carry are not a disqualification. They are the very places God intends to fill with clarity, courage, and renewed strength, shaping you for what lies ahead as this message continues to unfold. As the weight of inner battles settles into the heart, something remarkable happens when you return to the opening declaration of Psalm 27. The Lord is my light, and my salvation is not merely a poetic phrase, but a spiritual anchor for moments when darkness feels overwhelming. Light is not appreciated by those who live comfortably in brightness. It becomes precious to the ones who know what it feels like to sit in emotional fog, uncertainty, or spiritual fatigue. When faith feels weak, that single line becomes less of a statement and more of a lifeline, reminding you that even the smallest glimmer of divine presence can disrupt the deepest shadows. Darkness in the soul rarely appears all at once. It creeps in gradually, through disappointments that were never fully processed, prayers that seemed unanswered, seasons where God felt silent, or fears that grew louder than confidence. And when those shadows stretch long across the heart, you may begin to believe you have drifted too far from God or lost the spiritual strength you once carried. But this verse reveals something profoundly encouraging. Light does not depend on your strength. Light simply has to exist for darkness to lose its grip. David understood this intimately. He knew what it meant to walk through valleys of confusion and danger, yet he also knew that the presence of God has a way of dissolving fear even when circumstances do not change. Light in Scripture is not just illumination, it is revelation, direction, comfort, and restoration. It clarifies what fear distorts. It exposes lies your heart has accepted as truth. It reminds you that God is not distant, even when your emotions tell you otherwise. And salvation in this context is not limited to rescue from physical danger. It is deliverance from despair, from hopelessness, from internal darkness that tries to settle where faith is meant to live. When your faith feels weak, reading the Lord is my light becomes an act of quiet rebellion against everything trying to convince you that you are alone. It is a declaration that even if you cannot see the path ahead, God is already illuminating what needs to be revealed. It is acceptance of the truth that your courage is not expected to come from your own ability, but from His presence guiding you step by step. Maybe you have been waiting for a moment where everything becomes clear, expecting a sudden burst of spiritual strength. But sometimes renewal begins with something softer, quieter, almost unnoticed, a gentle shift inside when you remember that God is your light even when you feel lost. The renewal of faith does not always arrive like a breakthrough. Sometimes it begins like dawn, slowly pushing back the night until your vision adjusts and your heart begins to breathe again. As this Message continues to unfold. Allow this truth to settle deeply into you. The presence of God is not weakened by your weakness. His light is not dimmed by your confusion. His salvation is not delayed by your fear. Even the faintest flicker of divine light is enough to begin transforming the darkness around you and within you, preparing your heart for what comes next in the journey of Psalm 27. Fear has a way of shrinking the world around you until even simple decisions feel overwhelming. It clouds judgment, magnifies threats, steals rest, and convinces you that danger is closer than God. And when faith is weak, fear does not simply visit the heart, it settles there. But Psalm 27 confronts that quiet paralysis in a profound way, not by denying that fear exists, but by revealing how the presence of God reframes everything fear tries to distort. David writes confidently, "Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident." Yet the confidence he describes is not the confidence of someone untouched by struggle. It is the confidence of someone who learned courage in the middle of trembling. Courage in Scripture is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to anchor yourself in truth even when your emotions resist it. Fear says you are unprotected. Faith whispers that God is surrounding you even when you cannot feel Him. Fear insists that the worst is coming. Faith quietly counters that God is already in the future, preparing provision, strength, and clarity. What makes Psalm 27 so powerful is that it does not ask you to pretend. It asks you to shift your focus. When fear attempts to pull your attention toward threats, God invites you to look toward His character, His constancy, His promises that have held generations before you. There are moments in life when fear becomes internal, almost indistinguishable from your own thoughts. You may begin questioning your worth, your future, your safety, even your identity in God. The emotional instability that follows can make you feel weak or spiritually inadequate. But this psalm reveals that emotional turbulence does not disqualify you from receiving divine strength. In fact, it is often the place where God meets you most tenderly. David does not speak as a man who never wavered. He speaks as someone who learned to steady his soul by returning again and again to the presence of God. When fear intensifies, your mind searches for solid ground. Psalm 27 offers that ground, reminding you that God is not merely a distant protector, but a present refuge. Courage returns not through force, but through alignment. Emotional stability rises not through denial of fear, but through remembering that God stands closer than the threat. In this way, courage becomes less about how strong you feel and more about who you choose to trust when your strength is drained. Maybe you have felt that paralysis lately, the hesitation before stepping into something new, the trembling that comes with uncertainty, the quiet anxiety that lingers even in peaceful moments. Yet as you sit with the words of this psalm, you may begin to notice a subtle shift. The same God who strengthened David in his trembling is reaching toward your trembling now, not to shame you, but to steady you, not to demand perfection, but to remind you that even shaken hearts can rise again. If this part of the message speaks to something you have lived or felt, share in the comments what resonated with you as a way of giving voice to what fear often keeps silent. There are moments in life when the soul does not simply feel tired but wounded, as if something inside you has been quietly bruised by disappointments, unanswered prayers, or the weight of responsibilities you were never meant to carry alone. Confusion becomes a fog that blurs your sense of direction, leaving you unsure of what to pray for, what to hope for, or even what you truly need. It is in this tender and fragile space that the words of Psalm 27 begin to sound less like an ancient declaration and more like the very cry rising from your own heart. When David says, "Hear my voice when I call, O Lord," he is speaking as someone who knows what it is to plead for clarity when everything feels uncertain. Confusion has a way of making you question both yourself and God. You may wonder why certain doors remain closed, why relationships shifted, why timing seems delayed, or why the peace you once felt has become harder to find. And yet, this psalm reveals something essential about these seasons. Confusion is not evidence that God has withdrawn. It is often the place where he invites you to seek him more deeply. David does not run to solutions, strategies, or human reassurance. He runs to presence. His first instinct is not to demand answers, but to draw near, as if his soul understands that refuge is not found in explanations, but in the nearness of God. Seeking the presence of God is not a passive act. It is an inward turning, a quiet surrender, a recognition that clarity comes not from figuring everything out, but from resting in the one who sees what you cannot. Confusion in the heart often signals transition in the spirit, a shift happening beneath the surface, preparing you for something you may not yet understand. And while confusion may unsettle your emotions, it does not unsettle the foundation of who God is. His presence remains steady even when your thoughts are scattered. David knew this intimately. Surrounded by enemies, betrayed by those he trusted, facing circumstances that made no sense, he discovered that the safest place was not a physical shelter, but communion with God. When he prayed, "Do not hide your face from me," it was the plea of a wounded heart, longing for reassurance. Not because God had disappeared, but because moments of pain make the soul crave affirmation. And in that longing, something beautiful happens. Vulnerability becomes the doorway through which God restores strength. Maybe you have been carrying questions that have lingered too long. Maybe you have felt spiritually disoriented, unsure of the next step. But the message of this psalm is clear. You do not have to navigate confusion by yourself. You are allowed to cry out. You are allowed to feel wounded. You are allowed to draw near to God, not as someone who has everything under control, but as someone who simply needs refuge. And it is exactly in that posture that faith begins to breathe again, allowing the presence of God to settle into the deepest places of your uncertainty as this journey continues to unfold. Some battles in life never make a sound. No one sees the intensity of them. No one knows how fiercely they strike. They happen in the mind, in the heart, in the quiet corners of the soul, where discouragement tries to take root. These are the wars that exhaust you long before the day even begins, the thoughts that whisper you are not strong enough, the doubts that suggest God may not intervene, the heaviness that makes every step feel heavier than the last. And it is precisely for battles like these that Psalm 27 becomes more than a comforting passage. It becomes a weapon. When David declares, "Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear," he is not merely referring to external enemies. He is describing the internal forces that rise against the soul: fear, anxiety, self-doubt, despair. These invisible armies form quietly, building their strength through negative thoughts, exhausting emotions, and circumstances that challenge your stability. But instead of surrendering to them, David confronts them with truth. He lifts his voice not to pretend the war does not exist, but to remind his soul that God stands in authority over every attack. There is a deep spiritual principle hidden here. Defeat does not begin with circumstances. It begins with thoughts. What the mind rehearses, the heart eventually believes. And when your inner dialogue turns toward fear or hopelessness, your spirit begins to feel cornered. Psalm 27 interrupts that pattern by realigning your thoughts with the presence of God. It redirects your focus from what threatens you to the one who strengthens you. The more David speaks truth, the weaker fear becomes. The more he declares who God is, the quieter the voices of defeat grow. This psalm equips you in the same way. When your thoughts begin to spiral, you can respond with the assurance that God is not only aware of your internal battles, but actively fighting for you within them. Spiritual warfare is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is as simple and powerful as choosing which voice to agree with, the voice of fear or the voice of God. When your mind insists that you are alone, the psalm reminds you that God is your stronghold. When discouragement says nothing will change, the psalm declares that salvation is already at work, even if you cannot yet see it. These unseen battles are not signs of spiritual weakness. They are signs that something within you is still fighting for the light. Even in silence, even in emotional fatigue, you have not given up. And that matters. David often battled dark thoughts, yet through them he learned that the presence of God has the power to dismantle inner warfare from the inside out. That same presence is available to you. The more you allow these words to echo within you, the more they begin to reshape the very battlefield where your thoughts once felt overwhelming. As this journey through Psalm 27 continues, realize that the war inside you is not the end of your story. It is the terrain where God is preparing to reveal strength you did not know you had, guiding you toward the next revelation hidden within this psalm. When the noise of fear, confusion, and inner battles finally quiets, even if only for a moment, something profound begins to surface inside the heart. It is the longing for God Himself, not for answers, not for relief, but for closeness. That longing is captured in one of the most intimate lines of Psalm 27. "One thing I ask of the Lord, this only do I seek." These words reveal a shift inside David, a movement from desperation to desire, from survival to connection. He recognizes that beyond protection, beyond rescue, beyond all the struggles he faces, there is something his soul needs even more. The presence of God as a place to dwell, not just a place to run to in emergencies. This is not a request driven by fear. It is a hunger awakened by the realization that true restoration comes from proximity to the one who made you. When David says that he longs to dwell in the house of the Lord, he is not referring to a building or a physical temple. He is expressing a desire to live in a state of awareness of God's presence, a posture of the heart that steadies the mind and reshapes the soul. In his longing, he reveals an important truth. The deepest wounds cannot be healed by circumstances improving. They are healed when the heart reconnects with the source of its strength. There is a transformation that happens when you shift from seeking answers to seeking God Himself. Confusion begins to lose its grip. Fear begins to soften. The internal battles that once felt overwhelming begin to quiet, not because they disappear, but because your focus has changed. When your heart turns toward God, even in weakness, something inside you realigns. The presence of God creates clarity where there was fog, peace where there was tension, tenderness where there was exhaustion. It is in this space that restoration begins from the inside out. Maybe you have felt this longing too, even if you didn't have words for it. A quiet pull in your spirit, a sense that what you truly need is not certainty, but connection. You may not have understood why, but deep within, your heart has been asking for the same thing David asked for, to dwell in the presence of the Lord, to experience a peace that circumstances cannot steal. It is remarkable how the soul knows what it needs long before the mind catches up. When everything feels unstable, it instinctively reaches for the only place where stability is found. This longing is not weakness. It is evidence of spiritual life still burning inside you. Even in seasons when your faith feels faint, your heart continues to reach toward God. And as you sit with this part of the psalm, you may begin to notice that the deeper restoration you long for does not come from unraveling mysteries or solving every problem. It comes from allowing God to draw you into a closeness that renews your strength in ways nothing else can. If any part of this awakening resonates with something inside you, Share in the comments what this longing has stirred in your heart, giving voice to what many feel but rarely express. Waiting is one of the hardest experiences in spiritual life, not because time itself is unbearable, but because silence leaves room for fear to speak. When prayers seem unanswered and the future feels suspended, the mind quickly begins to fill the quiet with doubt. You start wondering if God has withdrawn, if you missed something, or if your situation will remain unresolved indefinitely. Yet this is precisely the space where Psalm 27 takes a deeper, more intimate turn. David speaks as someone who has tasted divine silence and learned that waiting is not evidence of abandonment, but a sacred process where strength is quietly rebuilt. Waiting exposes what lies beneath the surface. It reveals what your heart trusts, what it fears, what it clings to when certainty disappears. But David reframes the experience entirely. Instead of resisting the wait, he leans into it with a posture of expectation. He does not fill the silence with panic. He fills it with confidence that God remains active even when his voice is not heard. This shift in perspective is crucial because waiting is not a pause in your story. It is part of the transformation itself. While you wait, something is happening within you that could never develop in moments of clarity or ease. There is a quiet strength that forms only in seasons of delayed answers. It is the kind of strength that teaches you to anchor your heart, not in outcomes, but in the character of God. When David says, "I remain confident of this," he is not expressing confidence in circumstances improving. He is expressing confidence in the goodness of God, regardless of circumstances. He refuses to let silence define God's intentions. He refuses to let delay interpret God's faithfulness. In doing so, he chooses a deeper form of trust, one that does not depend on what he can see or feel. Waiting becomes a spiritual training ground where your fears are confronted, your desires purified, and your dependence on God deepens. It is often where spiritual maturity is forged, not through force, but through surrender, not through clarity, but through quiet perseverance. In the silence, God reveals parts of your heart you never noticed and strengthens parts of your spirit you did not know were weak. The wait itself becomes a sacred invitation to lean closer, to breathe slower, to see God not as distant, but as present in ways that transcend emotion. Maybe you have been in this place for longer than you expected. Maybe you have waited for healing, direction, restoration, or a breakthrough that still feels distant. And part of you wonders if God has forgotten your prayer. But the truth embedded in Psalm 27 is this: waiting is not a delay in God's love. It is evidence that He is shaping something within you that requires time, tenderness, and divine precision. The silence is not empty, it is full of purpose, preparing your spirit for the moment when clarity returns and your heart is strong enough to carry what God has been aligning for you. As you continue through this journey of the psalm, let this understanding settle into your spirit. Waiting is not a punishment, it is a preparation, gently strengthening your faith for what is still unfolding ahead. There is a moment in Psalm 27 where the tone shifts again, but this time it is not driven by fear, longing, or waiting. It is driven by a quiet, almost defiant confidence. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. These words rise from David not as wishful thinking, but as a prophetic declaration spoken in the middle of circumstances that gave him no logical reason to hope. He is surrounded by threats, weighed down by uncertainty, and still waiting for God to act. Yet he speaks with conviction about a future he cannot yet see. This is the kind of faith that does not emerge from strength, but from surrender, the surrender of needing proof in order to trust. David is not denying the reality of his situation. He is simply refusing to let his situation define the limits of God's goodness. He chooses to believe that goodness is not something that belongs only to the past, nor something reserved only for eternity, but something God intends to reveal here, in this life, even in the middle of chaos. That kind of confidence is not born from comfort, it is born from history. David remembers who God has been, how God has acted, and how often God has remained faithful, even when circumstances seemed impossible. The memory of God's character becomes the fuel for his declaration. When your own circumstances appear immovable, it can feel almost unreasonable to speak this way. You may feel unprepared to declare anything with confidence when fear is whispering, when waiting is stretching longer than expected, or when weakness still lingers in your heart. But this psalm reveals that confidence is not something you create. It is something you receive. It grows from choosing to trust that what God has spoken about your life is truer than what circumstances attempt to suggest. It emerges from remembering moments when grace appeared unexpectedly, when strength rose quietly, when hope returned even after disappointment. This prophetic confidence is not loud, it is steady. It anchors you when emotions fluctuate. It points you forward when your vision feels blurred. It reminds you that your story is not defined by the hardest chapter you are living, but by the God who continues writing beyond it. The declaration, "I will see the goodness of the Lord," does not erase pain, but it refuses to let pain dictate the future. It is the spiritual posture of someone who has learned that God often works beneath the surface long before change becomes visible. Maybe you have reached a point where believing in goodness feels difficult. Maybe your heart carries fatigue from too many setbacks, too many prayers that seem suspended in silence. Yet even now, David's words invite you into a different way of seeing your circumstances. Instead of asking when things will change, this verse invites you to trust that something is already forming, already aligning, already unfolding in ways your eyes cannot yet perceive. The promise of goodness becomes the thread that pulls your heart forward, guiding you toward a future shaped not by fear, but by divine intention. As the psalm moves toward its final message, this quiet confidence becomes the foundation for what comes next, preparing the heart to hear the closing invitation that ties the journey together. As Psalm 27 reaches its final breath, the tone becomes both tender and resolute, as if David is speaking not only to himself, but to anyone whose heart has ever wavered. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart. These words do not come from a man who has avoided pain. They come from someone who has walked through fear, confusion, longing, and silence, yet discovered that faith can rise again even when the soul feels worn thin. The psalm closes with an invitation, not a command, calling you gently back into strength, back into hope, back into the quiet confidence that God has not abandoned your story. The beauty of this final verse is that it acknowledges the struggle without glorifying it. It recognizes that waiting is hard, that courage sometimes slips, that fear still attempts to speak, and yet it insists that renewal is possible. Strength does not return in a sudden burst. It often comes in slow, steady breaths. Faith does not reappear like lightning. It grows like dawn, gradually illuminating what once felt hidden. David is not telling you to pretend you are strong. He is reminding you that strength is being formed within you even now in ways that your heart may not yet recognize. There is a quiet confidence woven through this final message. Your story is not ending in uncertainty. Something is unfolding, even if it feels distant. The same God who carried David through countless storms is carrying you through yours. The same presence that restored him is reaching toward you, not demanding perfection, but offering support, reassurance, and direction. When David says, "Wait for the Lord," he is not describing a passive posture. He is describing a steady one, a stance of expectation, a belief that the goodness spoken earlier in the psalm will reveal itself in the right time and in the right way. Maybe this psalm has touched places in you that have been quiet for a long time. Maybe it has reminded you of strength you thought you lost, or maybe it has shown you that even in seasons when your faith feels weak, God is still working, still guiding, still renewing what life tried to break. If your heart feels a little lighter, a little braver, or a little more open than before, that itself is evidence that something is being restored within you. As we close this journey through Psalm 27, if this message stayed with you until now, consider letting me know by leaving a comment with the phrase, "This message was for me." It helps you give voice to your own experience and lets me know this kind of content is reaching the hearts that need it. And if you feel that this reflection brought clarity or comfort, a simple like on the video supports the channel more than you realize. If you have not subscribed yet, this is a good moment to join us so you do not miss the next messages that continue building your spiritual strength. And if your heart is open to keep exploring, there is another video right here that deepens this same theme, so click and continue this path with me as we move forward in faith.